Before we begin, I want you to imagine something. You're a young woman, devoted to your faith, living a quiet life serving your goddess. Then one day, the most powerful man in your world decides he wants you. And when he takes what he wants, you're the one who gets punished. This isn't a modern story. This is the real story of Medusa. And everything you think you know about her is wrong. For thousands of years, we've been told that Medusa was a monster. A creature so hideous that one look at her would turn you to stone. Hollywood has made millions depicting her as the ultimate villain that heroes must destroy. But what if I told you that this story, this narrative we've accepted for millennia, is actually one of the greatest cover-ups in mythological history? Today, we are going to uncover the truth. We are going to explore not just what happened to Medusa, but why her story was changed, how it reflects ancient attitudes toward women and power, and why understanding her real story is more important today than ever before. This is going to be a long one, so grab a coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's get started on this journey to uncover the real Medusa. Let's start with the version most people know. According to the common telling, Medusa was one of three Gorgon sisters. Her sisters, Athena and Uriel, were immortal monsters from birth. But Medusa, she was the mortal one, the unlucky sister who could be killed. The story goes that she was born with snakes for hair and a gaze that turned anyone who looked at her into stone. She lived on a remote island, surrounded by the stone statues of those unfortunate enough to meet her eyes. Enter Perseus, the hero. Given an impossible task by a king who wanted him dead, Perseus had to bring back Medusa's head. With help from the gods, Athena's shield, Hermes' winged sandals, and Hades' helmet of invisibility, he snuck up on the sleeping Medusa and cut off her head. The head became a weapon. It retained its power even in death, turning enemies to stone. Perseus used it to save his mother, defeat his enemies, and eventually gave it to Athena, who placed it on her shield. It's a classic hero's journey, right? Brave warrior defeats terrible monster, saves the day. This version has been retold countless times, from ancient Greek pottery to modern blockbuster movies. But here's the thing that should make us all suspicious: in most of these retellings, we never learn why Medusa became a monster. She just was one. Born that way, apparently. Case closed. Except that's not what the ancient sources actually say. And when we dig deeper, we find a story that's far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more relevant to our modern world. To understand the real story of Medusa, we need to go back to the sources. And that's where things get interesting, because different ancient writers told different versions of her story. The earliest Greek sources, writers like Hesiod in the 8th century BCE, present Medusa as one of the primordial monsters. In his Theogony, she's just born that way, a child of the sea deities Phorcys and Cedo. But then we get to the Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century CE. And Ovid tells us a completely different story. In his Metamorphoses, he gives us Medusa's origin story, and it changes everything. According to Ovid, Medusa wasn't born a monster. She was a beautiful young woman, a priestess serving in the temple of Athena. She had taken vows of chastity and was devoted to the goddess of wisdom. Now, some scholars argue that Ovid was just adding Roman sensibilities to Greek myths, that he was making up new stories. But here's what's fascinating: archaeological evidence suggests that the transformation story is actually older than we thought. Vase paintings from the 5th century BCE show Medusa with human features alongside her monstrous ones. Some show her transformation in progress. This suggests that the idea of Medusa as a transformed human, not a born monster, was already part of Greek oral tradition. So what was this transformation story? What happened to turn a beautiful priestess into a monster? The answer lies in one of the most disturbing episodes in all of Greek mythology. And it involves the god Poseidon. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that we are about to discuss sexual assault. This is a serious topic, and I'm going to handle it with the gravity it deserves. If you need to take a break, that's completely understandable. According to Ovid's account, Poseidon saw Medusa in Athena's temple and desired her. But this wasn't a story of romance or seduction. This was about power. Poseidon was one of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon. Brother to Zeus, ruler of the seas, earthquakes, and horses. When he wanted something, he took it. And what he wanted was Medusa. The assault happened in Athena's temple. Think about the symbolism here. This wasn't just a violation of Medusa, it was a violation of sacred space, a desecration of Athena's holy ground. Now, you might be thinking, surely Athena would punish Poseidon for this outrage. Surely the goddess of wisdom and justice would seek vengeance against the god who violated her temple and her priestess. But that's not what happened. Instead, Athena blamed Medusa. Let me read you Ovid's actual words, translated, the daughter of the sea god violated the virgin in Minerva's temple. The goddess turned away and covered her chaste eyes with her aegis. And so that the deed might not go unpunished, she changed the Gorgon's hair to foul snakes. Did you catch that? So that the deed might not go unpunished, but who was being punished? Not Poseidon, the perpetrator. Medusa, the victim. Athena's logic, if we can call it that, was that Medusa's purity had been violated. Her vow of chastity had been broken. Never mind that it wasn't her choice. Never mind that she was the victim of a crime. In Athena's eyes, she was now tainted. So Athena transformed Medusa into a monster. Her beautiful hair became writhing snakes. Her lovely face became so hideous that anyone who looked at her would turn to stone. She was exiled from human society, forced to live alone on a desolate island. But the punishment went even deeper than that. Think about what it means to have a gaze that kills. Medusa could never again have human contact. She could never look at another person without destroying them. She was condemned to absolute isolation. And then, as if this wasn't enough, she was hunted down and killed by a hero who was celebrated for it. Perseus didn't slay a monster, he executed a victim who was already suffering. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This is just a myth. It's not real. Why does it matter? But here's the thing, myths matter because they shape how we think about the world. The story of Medusa is a perfect example of victim blaming, and it's a pattern that's repeated throughout human history. When someone in power commits a crime, it's often easier to blame the victim than to hold the powerful accountable. Think about it from Athena's perspective. She's faced with a terrible situation. Her temple has been violated, her priestess has been assaulted. But Poseidon is her uncle, a fellow god, someone she can't really challenge directly without starting a war among the gods. So what does she do? She takes the path of least resistance. She blames Medusa. It's psychologically easier, politically safer, and it maintains the power structure. This is what psychologists call just world fallacy, the tendency to believe that bad things happen to people because they somehow deserve it. It's more comfortable to think that victims are somehow responsible for their suffering than to acknowledge that sometimes terrible things happen to innocent people. In ancient Greek culture, this was reinforced by ideas about purity and pollution. Women were seen as vessels that could be contaminated by sexual contact, even non-consensual contact. Once polluted, they were seen as dangerous to society. But here's what's really insidious about Medusa's story, it doesn't just blame the victim, it turns the victim into a monster. It literally transforms her into something that society has the right to destroy. This is the ultimate victim blaming. Not only is it your fault that you were assaulted, but now you're a danger to everyone else. You're no longer a person deserving of sympathy, you're a monster that needs to be eliminated. Let's talk about Perseus, because his story is usually framed as the classic hero's journey. But when we understand Medusa's real story, Perseus becomes a much more complicated figure. Perseus was sent to kill Medusa by King Polydectes, who wanted to marry Perseus's mother, Danae. Danae refused, so Polydectes decided to get rid of her son by sending him on what should have been a suicide mission. The gods helped Perseus succeed. Athena gave him a mirrored shield so he could see Medusa without looking directly at her. Hermes gave him winged sandals for flight. Hades provided a helmet of invisibility. But let's think about this for a moment. The gods, including Athena, who was responsible for Medusa's transformation in the first place, are now helping someone kill her. Why? From one perspective, Perseus is just a pawn in a larger game. He's being used by Polydectes to remove an obstacle to his marriage plans. He's being used by the gods to clean up a mess they created. But from another perspective, Perseus is complicit in a system that victimizes women. He doesn't question his mission. He doesn't ask why Medusa became a monster. He just accepts that she's evil and needs to be destroyed. And here's the really disturbing part: Perseus doesn't just kill Medusa. He uses her death for his own benefit. He carries her head around as a weapon, using it to turn his enemies to stone. Think about the symbolism here. Even in death, Medusa's pain is being used to serve men's purposes. Her trauma becomes a tool for male heroes to achieve their goals. The traditional hero's journey is supposed to be about growth, about learning, about becoming a better person. But what does Perseus learn? What does he sacrifice? How does he grow? He doesn't. He starts as a young man willing to kill for glory, and he ends as a celebrated hero who's killed for glory. The only difference is that he's now famous for it. To truly understand Medusa's story, we need to understand the world that created it. What was life like for women in ancient Greece? The simple answer is not great. Ancient Greek society was deeply patriarchal. Women had few rights, little autonomy, and were generally seen as property of their fathers or husbands. In Athens, women couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't even leave their homes without permission. They were expected to be silent, invisible, and obedient. The only women who had any real independence were priestesses and hetairae, high-class courtesans. And even they operated within strict social constraints. So when we hear about Medusa as a priestess, we are talking about one of the few roles where a woman could have some autonomy, some respect, some power. And even that was taken away from her. But here's what's really interesting: despite this patriarchal society, Greeks also had a complex relationship with female power. Their mythology is full of powerful goddesses: Athena, Artemis, Demeter, Hera. Yet these goddesses often punish other women rather than the men who harm them. Hera takes revenge on Zeus's lovers and illegitimate children, not on Zeus himself. Artemis turns Actaeon into a deer for seeing her naked, but also punishes women who break their vows of chastity. This suggests that even divine feminine power was channeled into maintaining patriarchal order. The goddesses weren't really challenging the system, they were enforcing it. And nowhere is this clearer than in Medusa's story. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, makes the same mistake that humans make: she blames the victim instead of the perpetrator. Now, you might be thinking this is all ancient history. But the patterns we see in Medusa's story are still very much with us today. How many times have we seen assault victims asked what they were wearing, why they were out alone, whether they were drinking? How many times have we seen the focus shift from the perpetrator's actions to the victim's behavior? The Medusa complex, my term for the tendency to turn victims into monsters, is alive and well. Think about how women who speak out about assault are often portrayed in media. They are called liars, attention seekers, or worse. They are demonized, their character is attacked, their past is scrutinized. They are transformed from victims into villains, just like Medusa was. And just like in ancient Greece, it's often easier to blame the victim than to hold powerful men accountable. Look at how long it took for Harvey Weinstein to face consequences, despite decades of accusations. The Me Too movement has been fighting against this exact pattern. It's been saying, essentially, stop turning victims into monsters. Start holding perpetrators accountable. But the backlash against Me Too often follows the same pattern as Medusa's story. Women who speak out are painted as dangerous, as man-haters, as threats to society. They are turned into monsters that need to be silenced. Even the language we use reflects this. We talk about false accusations destroying men's lives, but we rarely talk about how real assaults destroy women's lives. We worry about the damage to men's reputations, but not about the damage to women's bodies and minds. This is the Medusa complex in action. The victim becomes the villain, the perpetrator becomes the victim, and the real crime gets lost in the shuffle. But here's where the story gets hopeful. In recent decades, we've seen a remarkable reclamation of Medusa's image. Artists, writers, and activists have been telling her story differently. Feminist artists have reimagined Medusa not as a monster, but as a symbol of female rage, righteous anger at injustice. Her snake hair becomes a crown of power, her deadly gaze becomes a weapon against oppression. The fashion house Versace has used Medusa as their logo since the 1970s. Gianni Versace said he chose her because she represented power, beauty, and the ability to make people fall in love with you. In literature, authors like Madeline Miller and Jennifer Saint have retold Medusa's story from her perspective, showing her as a complex, sympathetic character rather than a one-dimensional monster. Social media has embraced Medusa energy, the idea that women have the right to be angry, to protect themselves, to turn their trauma into strength. And in psychology, some therapists are using Medusa as a symbol for trauma survivors. The idea is that sometimes we need to become monsters to be angry, to be protective, to be unapproachable in order to heal. This reframing is powerful because it acknowledges that Medusa's monstrosity wasn't inherent, it was a response to trauma. And sometimes, that response is necessary for survival. There's also been a reclamation of the concept of the deadly female gaze. Instead of seeing it as something to fear, it's being reimagined as a form of power, the ability to see through lies, to petrify those who would harm us. This is what reclaiming a narrative looks like. It's taking a story that was used to oppress and turning it into a story of empowerment. Let's dig deeper into what Medusa represents on a symbolic level, because I think there's even more to her story than we've explored. Snakes, which make up Medusa's hair, are powerful symbols in mythology. They represent transformation, rebirth, and wisdom. The snake sheds its skin and becomes new, just like Medusa was transformed. But snakes are also associated with the feminine divine in many cultures. The snake goddess was worshipped throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Some scholars think Medusa might be a remnant of these older goddess traditions. The idea that her gaze turns people to stone is also symbolically rich. Stone is permanent, unchanging. Maybe Medusa's gaze doesn't just kill, maybe it forces people to confront uncomfortable truths that they'd rather ignore. Think about it, what if the people who look at Medusa and turn to stone aren't dying, but being forced to stop and really see? To confront the reality of what was done to her. This interpretation makes Perseus's mirror shield even more meaningful. He can only defeat Medusa by refusing to look at her directly. He can only kill her by avoiding the truth of what she represents. And what about the fact that Medusa's blood gives birth to Pegasus, the winged horse? From her death comes something beautiful and free. Maybe this represents how trauma, while terrible, can also be transformed into something powerful. Some scholars have also pointed out that Medusa's image was used as a protective symbol in the ancient world. Her face appeared on shields, temples, and homes, not as a monster to be feared, but as a guardian to ward off evil. This suggests that even in ancient times, people understood that Medusa's power could be used for protection, not just destruction. So what can we learn from Medusa's story? What does it teach us about ourselves, our society, and how we treat victims of trauma? First, it teaches us to question the narratives we're given. For thousands of years, people accepted that Medusa was just a monster. It took modern scholars and artists to dig deeper and uncover the real story. How many other stories have we accepted without question? How many other monsters in our mythology, our history, our current events, might actually be victims? Second, it teaches us about the power of victim blaming. When we blame victims, we're not just being unfair to them, we're protecting the systems that created the problem in the first place. By making Medusa the monster, ancient Greek society didn't have to confront the real monster, a culture that allowed powerful men to assault women without consequences. Third, it teaches us about the importance of listening to women's voices. For too long, Medusa's story was told by men, for men. It's only when we center women's experiences that we get the full picture. Fourth, it shows us how trauma can be weaponized. Medusa's pain was turned into a tool for other people's purposes. Her head became a weapon for Perseus, a decoration for Athena's shield. But it also shows us how trauma can be transformed. Modern interpretations of Medusa turn her pain into power, her isolation into strength, her monstrosity into protection. Finally, it teaches us about the power of reframing narratives. The same story can be told as a heroic adventure or a tragic injustice, depending on whose perspective we take. When we tell Medusa's story from her perspective, Perseus stops being a hero and starts being a complicated figure. When we understand her trauma, her monstrosity becomes understandable, even justified. So, to answer the question we started with, was Medusa a victim or a monster? The answer is both. She was a victim who was turned into a monster by a society that refused to hold powerful men accountable. But the real monster in this story isn't Medusa. It's not even Poseidon, though he committed the crime. The real monster is a system that punishes victims and protects perpetrators. The real monster is a culture that finds it easier to blame women than to challenge men. The real monster is a society that turns trauma into weapons and victims into villains. And that monster is still with us today. Every time we ask what a victim was wearing, every time we question why they didn't report sooner, every time we worry more about false accusations than real assaults, we are feeding that monster. But here's the hopeful part: we can change this narrative. We can choose to see Medusa not as a monster, but as a survivor. We can choose to tell her story differently. And when we do that, we're not just honoring her memory, we are changing how we treat victims today. We are saying that trauma doesn't make someone a monster. We are saying that survival, even angry survival, is valid. Medusa's story is a mirror. It reflects our own attitudes toward victims, toward women, toward power. And if we don't like what we see in that mirror, we have the power to change it. The question isn't whether Medusa was a victim or a monster. The question is, what kind of society do we want to be? One that creates monsters out of victims, or one that creates justice out of trauma? That's our deep dive into the real story of Medusa. What do you think? Has this changed how you see her story? Are there other mythological figures you think deserve a second look? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, deep dives into the stories behind the stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the real monster is the one telling the story. See you next time.